Welcome to the overview of the PR3000, which is the compliance report for Title II Part A, that is also part of the ESA compliance reports available in eGrants. My name is Gerardo Ramirez, and I am the Title II Part A Program Director at the Texas Education Agency. Using the year 2122 as an example, to access the report, log into eGrants and select the Compliance Report tab. The Consolidated Compliance Report link is scheduled to be available beginning July 28, and the report is due by September 29. The table of contents for the Consolidated Compliance Report will initially have only one active link for the GS 2100, Applicant Information. Once the schedule has been completed, the compliance reports that are applicable to the LEA will become active, including the PR3000 for Title II Part A. Before we discuss the PR3000, I want to go over the navigation buttons. On the top right-hand side of the report is a button that will open the instruction document for the Consolidated Compliance Reports. At the bottom of the screen are the buttons to navigate back to the table of contents, to open a printable version for the PR3000, and to save the report. When the LEA selects the Save button, if there are any errors, the system will list an explanation of the errors at the top of the report. The LEA can use the Print Errors button that will appear on the right to print a copy of the errors and warnings for reference. If there are no errors or warnings, the system will indicate that the report has been saved successfully. The PR3000 is divided into 5 parts. Part 1, Funding Transferability. Part 2, Section 5211, Rural Education Achievement Program, REAP. Part 3, Program Expenditures and Activities Participation. Part 4, Program Compliance Self-Check. And Part 5, Additional Information, which is optional. In Part 1 of the report, the LEA will answer yes or no to indicate whether or not the LEA participated in the Fund and Transferability Program with its Title II Part A funds. If yes, the LEA will type the percentage of Title II Part A funds that were redirected to each applicable program, as well as the dollar amount of the redirected funds that were expended for those programs. In Part 2 of the report, the LEA will answer yes or no to indicate whether or not the LEA participated in the Rural Education Achievement Program with its Title II Part A funds. If yes, the LEA will type the percentage of Title II Part A funds that were redirected to each applicable program, as well as the dollar amount of the redirected funds that were expended for those programs. Please note that if the totals under alternative uses of funding in Part 2B add up to 100%, or if the combined totals under alternative uses of funds in Part 2B and under funding transferability in Part 1B add up to 100%, then Parts 3 and 4 will be disabled. Part 3, the section on Title II Part A expenditures, has been redesigned to mirror the corresponding section of the Consolidated Federal Grant Application. The activity categories included correspond to the areas of focus that are listed in statute. The LEA should indicate the amount of Title II Part A funds expended for each area of focus. In Part 4 of the Title II Part A Compliance Report, we have the Program Compliance Self-Check, which we will use as part of our program monitoring. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement might require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. The compliance items listed are a selection of program compliance requirements for compliance reporting purposes and not an all-inclusive listing of all the requirements for a particular program. For a complete listing of all the program compliance requirements, please see the program-specific and ESA provisions and assurances. Additional guidance concerning program requirements can be found in the Title II Part A Program Guide. The following Title II Part A compliance items have been selected for inclusion in the ESA Consolidated Compliance Report PR3000. Part 4 Program Compliance Self-Check includes alignment with the challenging state academic standards, meaningful consultation, coordination, prioritization of funds, and system of professional growth and improvement. When responding to the self-check questions, the LEA will indicate whether it is in compliance or not in compliance with each of the program requirements listed. In compliance means that the LEA is assuring that it has documentation readily available. Any or all documentation listed for the requirement might be requested during a validation or an audit. Not in compliance means the LEA acknowledges that it is not in compliance with the requirement. The LEA will use the space provided to explain how it plans to come into compliance for the following year. Not applicable is only an option for some questions. Part 4 of the PR3000 deals with the requirement that the LEA's Title II Part A activities will be aligned with the challenging state academic standards. The strongest documentation for compliance with this requirement will include relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan, linking the Title II Part A activities with the state academic standards. It will also include activity-related supporting documentation showing that activities were implemented. A chart showing possible types of activity-related documentation by class object code can be found on page 14 of the Title II Part A Program Guide. If the LEA is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the radio button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 4B lists 3 requirements related to meaningful consultation. The first of this is that the LEA includes all the required stakeholders in its consultation process. The required stakeholders include teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals, specialized instruction support personnel, charter school leaders for LEAs that have in-district charter schools, parents, community partners, and other organizations or partners with relevant and demonstrated expertise in programs and activities designed to meet the purpose of Title II Part A. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA should list the required stakeholders in the District Improvement Plan, and the supporting documentation should indicate their participation in the consultation process. The strongest documentation for compliance with this requirement will include relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan, listing the stakeholders and their roles. It will also include supporting documentation that demonstrates the involvement of the required stakeholders in the consultation process. This could include meeting agendas, minutes, sign-in sheets, materials used during consultation events, including evaluation data, and copies of relevant surveys and their composite results. By selecting the rating button for in compliance, The LEA is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the rating button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. The second item in Part 4B is the requirement for the LEA seeks advice from stakeholders described in the previous item regarding how best to improve the LEA's activities to meet the purpose of Title II Part A. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA must engage the required stakeholders in meaningful consultation. The required stakeholders should be listed in the district improvement plan, and supporting documentation should indicate that they were engaged in the consultation process in a meaningful way. The strongest documentation for compliance with this requirement will include relevant pages of the district improvement plan, listing the stakeholders and their roles. It will also include supporting documentation that demonstrates involvement of the required stakeholders in the consultation process. This could include meeting agendas, minutes, signing sheets, materials used during consultation events, and copies of relevant surveys and their composite results. By selecting the rated button for in compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation for its compliance with this requirement readily available and upon request by TEA and or auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the rating button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. The third item in Part 4B for meaningful consultation concerns the requirement that the LEA uses data in ongoing consultation to continually update and improve Title II Part A activities. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA must demonstrate that it consulted with its stakeholders throughout the school year. For example, a minimum will be consultation for the beginning of the school year, one meeting or survey to ascertain program status or program progress mid-year, and one meeting at the end of the year to evaluate the effectiveness of the Title II Part A activities that were conducted. The strongest documentation showing compliance with this requirement will include a calendar of scheduled consultation meetings, dated agendas and minutes, sign-in sheets or participant rosters, including roles. If used, a copy of handouts provided during the consultation events. If used, a copy of survey and its composite results. By selecting the rate button for in compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the rating button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 4C lists two requirements related to coordination. The first of this is that the LEA coordinates Title II Part A professional development activities with professional development activities provided through other federal, state, and local programs. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA must demonstrate its coordination through the following documentation. Official promotional materials showing coordination through other federal, state, and local programs for applicable activities. Relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan. Coordination meeting agendas and minutes, signing sheets, materials used during coordination events and or surveys and their results. And documentation showing use of funds in coordination through other federal, state, and local programs. By selecting the rating button for in compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the rating button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. The second coordination requirement is that the LEA coordinates activities under Title II Part A with other federal strategies, programs, and activities being conducted in the community. The LEA will demonstrate compliance with these requirements through official promotional materials showing coordination between the LEA and community partners for applicable activities, documentation showing use of funds in coordination with applicable community activities. By selecting the radio button for in compliance, the LEA is ensuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available and upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. If Title II Part A activities being conducted by the LEA have no related activity or organization existing within the community, the LEA may indicate that this requirement is not applicable. Part 4D deals with the requirement that the LEA must prioritize Title II Part A funds to schools served under school improvement under Section 1111D and that have the highest percentage of low-income children. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA must document how it prioritizes its Title II Part A funds based on the campus school improvement status and low-income percentage. The strongest documentation for compliance with this requirement will include relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan describing how the LEA's Title II Part A funds are prioritized to campuses based on school improvement status and percentage of low-income children. The LEA could include a chart showing campus names, school improvement status, poverty percentage, and Title II allocation amounts. By selecting the red button for in compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 4E deals with the requirement that the LEA must have a system of professional growth and improvement, such as induction for teachers, principals, or other school leaders, and opportunities for building the capacity of teachers, as well as opportunities to develop meaningful teacher leadership. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA must have documentation related to a system of professional growth and improvement. The strongest documentation for compliance with this requirement will include relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan describing the LEA's system of professional growth and improvement, as well as supporting documentation showing its implementation. By selecting the red button for in compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation for its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. If the LEA has any additional information relevant to PR3000 that it wishes to include, it may be typed into the space provided in Part 5. If the LEA needs assistance in completing the PR3000, there are resources available. The following resources are available on our website to assist LEAs in completing the compliance report. schedule mockups, the program compliance of chef guide, the instruction document, and the instruction video. LEAs may also reach out to the regional education center staff who are available to provide technical assistance and support prior to submission of the compliance report. ESC staff are also available to provide technical assistance to any LEA that report not in compliance for any of the compliance subject items. The purpose of the technical assistance will be to assist the LEA in meeting compliance in the following year. Thank you so much for your time and attention. If you have any questions, please reach out to support@tea.texas.gov or to any other information listed.